The fragility of modern money didn't emerge with recent crises. It was baked into the original design. The system that holds up the world was built with calculated intent engineered to centralize information, control flows, and turn credit into power. It was never meant to be static or stable. It was meant to be indispensable. And once a system becomes indispensable, it also becomes impossible to question. The biggest illusion of the contemporary era is believing money is just a neutral medium of exchange. It has never been neutral. It is an architecture, a deliberate construction, a set of invisible mechanisms that shape behavior, economic rhythms, and dependency between nations. The transition to this model didn't happen naturally. It was the result of accumulated pressure, silent disputes, and one permanent incentive: concentrating the ability to influence the future. Before money became numbers on screens, it was backing, metal, weight, it was limits, and limits force discipline. But societies that expand faster than their resources don't tolerate limits for long. That's where the modern system begins. At the moment, the world realized it needed something more flexible than gold and more manipulable than metal. Money stopped being a thing. It became a promise, and promises require someone to guarantee them. That's how the institutions that would shape the entire 20th century were born. Central banks, integrated markets, monetary standardization, and a new logic where credit wasn't an exception, it was the foundation. The shift wasn't just technical. It was philosophical. The financial system stopped reflecting wealth and started anticipating it, stopped recording value and started projecting it. This opened the door to accelerated growth, but also to a structural fragility that would be impossible to reverse. Dependence on credit became so deep that the model turned constant expansion into a basic requirement. Without expansion, no liquidity. Without liquidity, no stability. The system locked itself into a cycle where stopping meant breaking. And a world trapped in a system that cannot stop becomes a world willing to pay any price to keep the machine running. This is where the hidden architecture shows itself. Every crisis that looked accidental followed a pattern. Every growth jump carried a delayed cost. Every solution created a new vulnerability. The system gained efficiency but lost safety margin. Gained speed but lost control. Gained scale but lost backing. The promise that started everything, global stability, began corroding from the first brick. The very notion of value changed. It was no longer what you had. It was what you could convince the system to accept. This is the point where most observers stop. But the real question hasn't been asked yet. If the system was designed for infinite growth, what happens when growth itself becomes the threat? If this analysis makes sense to you, leave your comment. Your perspective matters in this debate. The episode continues from here. And from now on, the focus is no longer what the system appears to be. It's what it was designed to do, and inevitably, to undo. Nothing about what the system became can be understood without looking at the moment when the rules began to be rewritten. And that moment wasn't during recent crises. It was much earlier, when the world realized the old monetary order could no longer keep up with the speed of the economy. The early 20th century exposed a deep dilemma: war, global trade, rapid industrialization, and the need to finance ever-growing states created an uncomfortable truth. Gold was too solid for a world becoming too liquid. The metal couldn't keep pace with ambition. And ambition always wins. Governments realized they couldn't control their economies while depending on a physical resource, slow, finite, inflexible. Gold was impartial. And systems of power don't survive impartiality. That's when the logic of credit began to take over. First as a temporary fix, then as the foundation of the mechanism itself. Central banks gained relevance as guardians of stability, but their real consolidation came from something else: their ability to intervene, to adjust, to create liquidity where none existed. Over time, intervention stopped being the exception. It became routine, and routine turned into dependency. Every economic shock reinforced the same conclusion: the system only worked if someone could expand it. The promise of stability required continuous expansion, and continuous expansion required more credit. A self-reinforcing loop. The choices made in that era triggered a domino effect that still runs today. Monetary centralization didn't happen by accident. It was the answer to a world that needed to grow faster than its fundamentals allowed. And like every incomplete solution, it created a new set of problems. Once governments realized they could finance deficits without physical limits, the dynamic shifted. Spending no longer depended on revenue. Currencies no longer depended on reserves. And the economy no longer depended on real production. Credit took the wheel. The system became more efficient in the short term, but far more unstable in the long term. Its ability to patch crises expanded, but the cost of those patches grew even faster. Every intervention created the need for the next. The system required constant maintenance, and maintenance became part of the machine. Nothing illustrates this transition better than the interwar period. The world tried to resurrect the old model relink currencies to gold, restore lost discipline, but it was too late. The economy had outgrown the vault. Trying to return to the past generated tension. Tension generated instability. Instability generated more intervention. And intervention destroyed what little remained of the old order. From that point, causality became unavoidable. The modern system wasn't born from the final rupture, but from the early concessions, from every limit loosened, every exception normalized. What began as an emergency measure became permanent architecture. The centralization of global money wasn't built just to control supply. It was built to control the economic narrative. And whoever controls the narrative controls the perception of value. That's the mechanism most people don't see. Historical events weren't isolated accidents. They were layered decisions, all pushing the system toward the same destination: credit dependence, growing fragility, and a structural need for infinite expansion. When a system is built on something infinite, it's born already moving toward its own limit. Causality doesn't lie. It only collects. And now the real question flips. If the system had to abandon its limits to survive, what did it lose in the process? The next step reveals the internal structure of this dependency, the part that never appears on charts, the part that holds everything up and threatens everything at the same time. The true nature of the system becomes visible only when you look at its internal gears, not the official narrative, not the monetary surface, but the mechanism that turns debt into the appearance of stability. At the core of the modern model lies a simple and dangerous equation. For the system to function, it must grow. And to grow, it must expand credit. Credit isn't just fuel. It's support. It's the structural column. Without it, the entire architecture loses traction. This dependency created a dynamic that governs markets, governments, and central banks. A dynamic where liquidity is not a consequence, but a prerequisite. And any interruption in that flow generates instant instability. For decades, this mechanism was treated as a sign of efficiency. The ability to create money from debt made it possible to finance wars, reconstructions, technological revolutions, and industrial expansions. But that same capability built a system increasingly disconnected from its foundations. The economy grew on projections, markets grew on expectations, and expectations grew on guarantees that no longer existed. The structure began to operate like a closed circuit. Banks created credit, governments absorbed credit, markets monetized credit, and confidence held everything together. Confidence became the collateral. And confidence is the most volatile collateral ever invented. The current architecture works like a skyscraper whose columns must be reinforced constantly. Every layer requires expansion. Every expansion requires lower rates, higher risk, deeper leverage. Fractional reserves amplified this logic. Deposits became the base for multiple loans. The ability to multiply money without multiplying real wealth created a multiplier of fragility. The system became more elastic, but also more vulnerable to any rupture in the chain of confidence. Financial markets perfected this elasticity. Derivatives, securitization, synthetic instruments, and leverage turned risk into a product. And when risk becomes a product, it becomes infrastructure. Entire structures started depending on the existence of risk to generate returns. The economy became sophisticated, but that sophistication carried a hidden cost. The more layers, the more failure points. The more interconnection, the more shock propagation. The more artificial liquidity, the greater the distance between value and fundamentals. The architecture became so complex that few can see the cumulative effect. Each cycle requires more intervention. Each intervention requires more dependence. Each dependence requires abandoning more limits. The result is a structure where everything must work simultaneously. Rates, credit, confidence, liquidity, expectations. If any piece hesitates, the rest shakes. This is why crises became recurring. The structure doesn't collapse because something went wrong. It collapses because it only works as long as nothing goes wrong. That's the point almost no one admits. The system doesn't fail by exception. It fails because it was built on a logic of perpetual expansion. And nothing perpetual survives in a finite world. The modern architecture operates like an organism that only breathes in. It never exhales, never reduces, never contracts. Everything in it is designed to inflate. And inflating became its vital function. Fragility isn't external. It's internal, structural. The embedded cost of the promise of infinite flexibility. And when a system grows to the point where its own structure becomes the risk, it stops being just an economic model. It becomes a silent threat. The question now is no longer how we got here, but why we're still here. And what keeps the engine running even when stopping would be the only way to survive? The answer lies in the next move. A move that no longer depends on choice, but on consequence. Everything converges to a simple and inescapable point. The modern financial system isn't on the verge of rupture because it was mismanaged. It's on the verge because that is the logical consequence of its design. The architecture that enabled unlimited growth also planted the seed of permanent instability. And every solution that kept the system alive amplified the imbalance that now threatens its own continuity. The decisive shift happened when money stopped representing something and began to be authorized by something. And systems built on authorization prosper only as long as everyone believes in the authority behind them. But confidence cannot be manufactured indefinitely. It erodes under pressure. And the world has been accumulating pressure for decades. Globalization turned economies into interdependent gears. Multiplied debt became a condition for functioning. Artificial interest rates kept cycles alive past their natural limits. Central institutions intervened so many times that intervention became the norm, not the exception. And each intervention alters another piece of the arrangement. Each adjustment hides a risk. Each risk pushes the system into its next stress zone. Eventually, the architecture stops responding to command. It only reacts to its own weight. This moment doesn't arise from a single event. It arises from accumulation. A decade of stimulus, another of rate compression, another of balance sheet expansion. And a silent current nobody controls. The erosion of global confidence. The final paradox is obvious. The modern system promised stability but produced dependency. Promised predictability but cultivated volatility. Promised safety but delivered distributed fragility. Its internal logic became so rigid that any attempt to return to balance would trigger the same outcome, as trying to stop an engine that was never built to shut off. The structure doesn't break when growth slows. It breaks when growth is no longer enough to sustain the very expansion the system requires. That's why every recent crisis feels deeper. Not because the shock is larger, but because the structural margin is smaller. The system no longer has the shock absorbers it once had. The architecture has advanced too far. And now it lives at the edge between support and rupture. When you trace that trajectory as a continuous line, you inevitably reach the question no one likes to ask. If the system was designed to operate through permanent expansion, what happens when the world can no longer expand at the pace it demands? This isn't pessimism, it's mechanics. The model is confronting its own blueprint. And every architecture, when confronted by its design, reveals the truth it always tried to hide. Nothing built to last forever survives the moment its foundations no longer carry its weight. This is where the episode ends, but it doesn't close. Because the architecture described here is only the first foundation of a much larger order. If this episode clarified something for you, leave your insight in the comments and follow the next chapters. The next step reveals how an international agreement reorganized the entire world, and why it still defines everything we live today. The story continues at Bretton Woods,